These represent A, reported earnings, plus B, depreciation, depletion, amortization, and certain other non-cash charges such as company ends items 1 and 4, less C, the average annual amount of capitalized expenditures for plant and equipment, etc., that the business requires to fully maintain its long-term competitive position and its unit volume. If the business requires additional working capital to maintain its competitive position and unit volume, the increment also should be included in C. However, businesses following the LIFO inventory method usually do not require additional working capital if unit volume does not change. Our owner earnings equation does not yield the deceptively precise figures provided by GAAP, since C must be a guess, and one sometimes very difficult to make. Despite this problem, we consider the owner earnings figure, not the GAAP figure, to be the relevant item for valuation purposes, both for investors in buying stocks and for managers in buying entire businesses. The approach we have outlined produces owner earnings for Company O and Company N that are identical, which means valuations are also identical, just as common sense would tell you should be the case. The result is reached because the sum of A and B is the same in both columns O and N, and because C is necessarily the same in both cases. And what do Charlie and I, as owners and managers, believe is the correct figure for the owner earnings of Scott Fetzer? Under current circumstances, we believe C is very close to the old company's B number of $8.3 million and much below the new company's B number of $19.9 million. Therefore, we believe that owner earnings are far better depicted by the reported earnings in the O column than by those in the N column. In other words, we feel owner earnings of Scott Fetzer are considerably larger than the GAAP figures that we report. That is obviously a happy state of affairs, but calculations of this sort usually do not provide such pleasant news. Most managers probably will acknowledge that they need to spend something more than B on their businesses over the longer term just to hold their ground in terms of both unit volume and competitive position. When this imperative exists, that is, when C exceeds B, GAAP earnings overstate owner earnings. Frequently, this overstatement is substantial. The oil industry has, in recent years, provided a conspicuous example of this phenomenon. Had most major oil companies spent only B each year, they would have guaranteed their shrinkage in real terms. All of this points up the absurdity of the cash flow numbers that are often set forth in Wall Street reports. These numbers routinely include A plus B, but do not subtract C. Most sales brochures of investment bankers also feature deceptive presentations of this kind. These imply that the business being offered is the commercial counterpart of the pyramids, forever state-of-the-art, never needing to be replaced, improved, or refurbished. Indeed, if all U.S. corporations were to be offered simultaneously for sale through our leading investment bankers, and if the sales brochures describing them were to be believed, governmental projections of national plant and equipment spending would have to be slashed by 90%. Cash flow, true, may serve as a shorthand of some utility in descriptions of certain real estate businesses or other enterprises that make huge initial outlays and only tiny outlays thereafter. A company whose only holding is a bridge or an extremely long-lived gas field would be an example. But cash flow is meaningless in such businesses as manufacturing, retailing, extractive companies, and utilities because, for them, C is always significant. To be sure, businesses of this kind may in a given year be able to defer capital spending. But over a 5 or 10 year period, they must make the investment or the business decays. Why then are cash flow numbers so popular today? In an answer, we confess our cynicism. We believe these numbers are frequently used by marketers of businesses and securities in attempts to justify the unjustifiable, and thereby to sell what would be the unsaleable. When A, that is GAAP earnings, looks by itself inadequate to service debt of a junk bond or justify a foolish stock price, how convenient it becomes for salesmen to focus on A plus B. But you shouldn't add B without subtracting C. Though dentists correctly claim that if you ignore your teeth, they'll go away, the same is not true for C. The company or investor believing that the debt servicing ability or the equity valuation of an enterprise can be measured by totaling A and B while ignoring C is headed for certain trouble. To sum up, in the case of both Scott Fetzer and our other businesses, we feel that B, on a historical cost basis, i.e. with both amortization of intangibles and other purchase price adjustments excluded, is quite close in amount to C. The two items are not identical, of course. For example, at C's, we annually make capitalized expenditures that exceed depreciation by $500,000 to $1 million, simply to hold our ground competitively. Our conviction about this point is the reason we show our amortization and other purchase price adjustment items separately, and is also our reason for viewing the earnings of the individual businesses as much more closely approximating owner earnings than the GAAP figures. Questioning GAAP figures may seem impious to some. After all, what are we paying the accountants for if it is not to deliver us the truth about our business? But the accountant's job is to record, not to evaluate. The evaluation job falls to investors and managers. Accounting numbers, of course, are the language of business and as such are of enormous help to anyone evaluating the worth of a business and tracking its progress. Charlie and I would be lost without these numbers. They invariably are the starting point for us in evaluating our own businesses and those of others. Managers and owners need to remember, however, that accounting is but an aid to business thinking, never a substitute for it. Option valuation. The Black-Scholes formula has approached the status of holy writ in finance, and we use it when valuing our equity put options for financial statement purposes. Key inputs to the calculation include a contract's maturity and strike price, as well as the analyst's expectations for volatility, interest rates, and dividends. If the formula is applied to extended time periods, however, it can produce absurd results. In fairness, Black and Scholes almost certainly understood that point well. But their devoted followers may be ignoring whatever caveats the two men attached when they first unveiled the formula. It's often useful in testing a theory to push it to extremes. So let's postulate that we sell a 100-year, $1 billion put option on the S&P 500 at a strike price of 903, the index's level on December 31st, 2008. Using the implied volatility assumption for long-dated contracts that we do, and combining that with appropriate interest and dividend assumptions, we would find the proper Black-Scholes premium for this contract to be $2.5 million. To judge the rationality of that premium, we need to assess whether the S&P will be valued a century from now at less than today. Certainly the dollar will then be worth a small fraction of its present value. At only 2% inflation, it will be worth roughly 14 cents. So that will be a factor pushing the stated value of the index higher. Far more important, however, is that 100 years of retained earnings will hugely increase the value of most of the companies in the index. In the 20th century, the Dow Jones Industrial Average increased by about 175-fold, mainly because of this retained earnings factor. Considering everything, I believe the probability of a decline in the index over a 100-year period to be far less than 1%. But let's use that figure and also assume that the most likely decline, should one occur, is 50%. Under these assumptions, the mathematical expectation of loss on our contract would be $5 million, $1 billion times 1% times 50%. But if we had received our theoretical premium of $2.5 million up front, we would have only had to invest it at 0.7% compounded annually to cover this loss expectancy. Everything earned above that would have been profit. Would you like to borrow money for 100 years at a 0.7% rate? Let's look at my example from a worst-case standpoint. Remember that 99% of the time we would pay nothing if my assumptions are correct. But even in the worst case among the remaining 1% of possibilities, that is, one assuming a total loss of $1 billion, our borrowing cost would come to only 6.2%. Clearly, either my assumptions are crazy or the formula is appropriate. The ridiculous premium that Black-Scholes dictates in my extreme example is caused by the inclusion of volatility in the formula and by the fact that volatility is determined by how much stocks have moved around in some past period of days, months, or years. This metric is simply irrelevant in estimating the probability-weighted range of values of American business 100 years from now. Imagine, if you will, getting a quote every day on a farm from a manic-depressive neighbor and then using the volatility calculated from these changing quotes as an important ingredient in an equation that predicts a probability-weighted range of values for the farm a century from now. Though historical volatility is a useful but far from foolproof concept in valuing short-term options, its utility diminishes rapidly as the duration of the option lengthens. In my opinion, the valuations that the Black-Scholes formula now place on our long-term put options overstate our liability, though the overstatement will diminish as the contracts approach maturity. Even so, we will continue to use Black-Scholes when we are estimating our financial statement liability for long-term equity puts. The formula represents conventional wisdom, and any substitute that I might offer would engender extreme skepticism. That would be perfectly understandable. CEOs who have concocted their own valuations for esoteric financial instruments have seldom erred on the side of conservatism. That club of optimists is one that Charlie and I have no desire to join. Both Charlie and I believe that Black-Scholes produces wildly inappropriate values when applied to long-dated options. Besides the hypothetical example given above, we put our money where our mouth was by entering into our equity put contracts. By doing so, we implicitly asserted that the Black-Scholes calculations used by our counterparties or their customers were faulty. We continue, nevertheless, to use that formula in presenting our financial statements. Black-Scholes is the accepted standard for option valuation. Almost all leading business schools teach it, and we would be accused of shoddy accounting if we deviated from it. Moreover, we would present our auditors with an insurmountable problem were we to do that. They have clients who are our counterparties and who use Black-Scholes values for the same contracts we hold. It would be impossible for our auditors to attest to the accuracy of both their values and ours were the two far apart. Part of the appeal of Black-Scholes is to auditors and regulators is that it produces a precise number. Charlie and I can't supply one of those. We believe the true liability of our contracts to be far lower than that calculated by Black-Scholes, but we can't come up with an exact figure, any more than we can come up with a precise value for Geico, BNSF, or for Berkshire Hathaway itself. Our inability to pinpoint a number doesn't bother us. We would rather be approximately right than precisely wrong. John Kenneth Galbraith once slyly observed that economists were most economical with ideas. They made the ones learned in graduate school last a lifetime. University finance departments often behave similarly. Witness the tenacity with which almost all clung to the theory of efficient markets throughout the 1970s and 1980s, dismissively calling powerful facts that refuted it anomalies. I always love explanations of that kind. The Flat Earth Society probably views a ship circling of the globe as an annoying but inconsequential anomaly. Accounting shenanigans. Despite the shortcomings of generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, I would hate to have the job of devising a better set of rules. The limitations of the existing set, however, need not be inhibiting. CEOs are free to treat GAAP statements as a beginning rather than an end to their obligations to inform owners and creditors, and indeed they should. After all, any manager of a subsidiary company would find himself in hot water if he reported bare-bones GAAP numbers that omitted key information needed by his boss, the parent corporation's CEO. Why then should the CEO himself withhold information vitally useful to his bosses, the shareholder owners of the corporation? What needs to be reported is data, whether GAAP, non-GAAP, or extra GAAP, that helps financially literate readers answer three key questions. 1. Approximately how much is this company worth? 2. What is the likelihood that it can meet its future obligations? And 3. How good a job are its managers doing given the hand they have been dealt? In most cases, answers to one or more of these questions are somewhere between difficult and impossible to glean from the minimum GAAP presentation. The business world is simply too complex for a single set of rules to effectively describe economic reality for all enterprises, particularly those operating in a wide variety of businesses such as Berkshire. Further complicating the problem is the fact that many managements view GAAP not as a standard to be met, but as an obstacle to overcome. Too often their accountants willingly assist them. "How much," says the client, "is 2 plus 2? Replies the cooperative accountant, "What number did you have in mind?" Even honest and well-intentioned management sometimes stretch GAAP a bit in order to present figures they think will more appropriately describe their performance. Both the smoothing of earnings and the big bath quarter are white lie techniques employed by otherwise upright managements. Then there are managers who actively use GAAP to deceive and defraud. They know that many investors and creditors accept GAAP results as gospel. So these charlatans interpret the rules imaginatively and record business transactions in ways that technically comply with GAAP, but actually display an economic illusion to the world. As long as investors, including supposedly sophisticated institutions, place fancy valuations on reported earnings that march steadily upward, you can be sure that some managers and promoters will exploit GAAP to produce such numbers no matter what the truth may be. Over the years, Charlie and I have observed many accounting-based frauds of staggering size. Few of the perpetrators have been punished. Many have not even been censored. It has been far safer to steal large sums with a pen than small sums with a gun. Satire. U.S. Steel announces sweeping modernization scheme. Myron C. Taylor, chairman of U.S. Steel Corporation, today announced the long-awaited plan for completely modernizing the world's largest industrial enterprise. Contrary to expectations, no changes will be made in the company's manufacturing or selling policies. Instead, the bookkeeping system is to be entirely revamped. By adopting and further improving a number of modern accounting and financial devices, the corporation's earning power will be amazingly transformed. Even under the subnormal conditions of 1935, it is estimated that the new bookkeeping methods would have yielded a reported profit of close to $50 per share on the common stock. The scheme of improvement is the result of a comprehensive survey made by Messrs. Price, Bacon, Guthrie, and Colpitts. It includes the following 6 points. 1. Writing down of plant account to minus $1 billion. 2. Par value of common stock to be reduced to 1 cent. 3. Payment of all wages and salaries in option warrants. 4. Inventories to be carried at $1. 5. Preferred stock to be replaced by non-interest-bearing bonds redeemable at 50% discount. 6. A $1 billion contingency reserve to be established. The official statement of this extraordinary modernization plan follows in full. The Board of Directors of U.S. Steel Corporation is pleased to announce that after intensive study of the problems arising from changed conditions in the industry, it has approved a comprehensive plan for remodeling the corporation's accounting methods. A survey by a special committee, aided and abetted by Messrs. Price, Bacon, Guthrie, and Colpitts, revealed that our company has lagged somewhat behind other American business enterprises in utilizing certain advanced bookkeeping methods, by means of which the earning power may be phenomenally enhanced without requiring any cash outlay or any changes in operating or sales conditions. It has been decided not only to adopt these newer methods, but to develop them to a still higher stage of perfection. The changes adopted by the board may be summarized under 6 heads as follows. 1. Fixed assets to be written down to minus $1 billion. Many representative companies have relieved their income accounts of all charges for depreciation by writing down their plant account to $1. The special committee points out that if their plants are worth only $1, the fixed assets of U.S. Steel Corporation are worth a good deal less than that sum. It is now a well-recognized fact that many plants are in reality a liability rather than an asset, entailing not only depreciation charges, but taxes, maintenance, and other expenditures. Accordingly, the board has decided to extend the write-down policy initiated in the 1935 report and to mark down the fixed assets from $1,338,522,858 to around minus $1 billion. The advantages of this move should be evident. As the plant wears out, the liability becomes correspondingly reduced. Hence, instead of the present depreciation charge of some $47 million yearly, there will be an annual appreciation credit of 5%, or $50 million. This will increase earnings by no less than $97 million per annum. 2. Reduction of par value of common stock to 1 cent, and 3. Payment of salaries and wages in option warrants. Many corporations have been able to reduce their overhead expenses substantially by paying a large part of their executive salaries in the form of auctions to buy stock, which carry no charge against earnings. The full possibilities of this modern device have apparently not been adequately realized. The board of directors have adopted the following advanced form of this idea. The entire personnel of the corporation are to receive their compensation in the form of rights to buy common stock at $50 per share, at the rate of 1 purchase right for each $50 of salary and/or wages in their present amounts. The par value of the common stock is to be reduced to 1 cent. The almost incredible advantages of this new plan are evident from the following. A. The payroll of the corporation will be entirely eliminated, a saving of $250 million per annum based on 1935 operations. B. At the same time, the effective compensation of all our employees will be increased several-fold. Because of the large earnings per share to be shown on our common stock under the new methods, it is certain that the shares will command a price in the market far above the option level of $50 per share, making the readily realizable value of these option warrants greatly in excess of the present cash wages that they will replace. C. The corporation will realize an additional large annual profit through the exercise of these warrants. Since the par value of the common stock will be fixed at 1 cent, there will be a gain of $49.99 on each share subscribed for. In the interest of conservative accounting, however, this profit will not be included in the income account, but will be shown separately as a credit to capital surplus. D. The corporation's cash position will be enormously strengthened. In place of the present annual cash outgo of $250 million for wages, 1935 basis, there will be annual cash inflow of $250 million through exercise of the subscription warrants for 5 million shares of common stock. The company's large earnings and strong cash position will permit the payment of a liberal dividend which, in turn, will result in the exercise of these option warrants immediately after issuance which, in turn, will further improve the cash position which, in turn, will permit a higher dividend rate, and so on indefinitely. 4. Inventories to be carried at $1. Serious losses have been taken during the Depression due to the necessity of adjusting inventory value to market. Various enterprises, notably in the metal and cotton textile fields, have successfully dealt with this problem by carrying all or part of their inventories at extremely low unit prices. The U.S. Steel Corporation has decided to adopt a still more progressive policy and to carry its entire inventory at $1. This will be effected by an appropriate write-down at the end of each year, the amount of said write-down to be charged to the contingency reserve hereinafter referred to. The benefits to be derived from this new method are very great. Not only will it obviate all possibility of inventory depreciation, but it will substantially enhance the annual earnings of the corporation. The inventory on hand at the beginning of the year, valued at $1, will be sold during the year at an excellent profit. It is estimated that our income will be increased by means of this method to the extent of at least $150 million per annum, which, by a coincidence, will about equal the amount of the write-down to be made each year against contingency reserve. A minority report of the Special Committee recommends that accounts receivable and cash also be written down to $1 in the interest of consistency and to gain additional advantages similar to those just discussed. This proposal has been rejected for the time being because our auditors still require that any recoveries of receivables and cash so charged off be credited to surplus instead of to the year's income. It is expected, however, that this auditing rule, which is rather reminiscent of the horse and buggy days, will soon be changed in line with modern tendencies. Should this occur, the minority report will be given further and favorable consideration. 5. Replacement of preferred stock by non-interest-bearing bonds redeemable at 50% discount. During the recent depression, many companies have been able to offset their operating losses by including in income profits arising from repurchase of their own bonds at a substantial discount from par. Unfortunately, the credit of U.S. Steel Corporation has always stood so high that this lucrative source of revenue has not hitherto been available to it. The modernization scheme will remedy this condition. It is proposed that each share of preferred stock be exchanged for $300 face value of non-interest-bearing sinking fund notes, redeemable by lot at 50% of face value in 10 equal annual installments. This will require the issuance of $1,080,000,000 of new notes, of which $108 million will be retired each year at a cost to the corporation of only $54 million, thus creating an annual profit of the same amount. Like the wage and/or salary plan described under 3 above, this arrangement will benefit both the corporation and its preferred stockholders. The latter are assured payment for their present shares at 150% of par value over an average period of 5 years. Since short-term securities yield practically no return at present, the non-interest-bearing feature is of no real importance. The corporation will convert its present annual charge of $25 million for preferred dividends into an annual bond retirement profit of $54 million, an aggregate yearly gain of $79 million. 6. Establishment of a contingency reserve of $1 billion. The directors are confident that the improvements hereinbefore described will assure the corporation of a satisfactory earning power under all conditions in the future. Under modern accounting methods, however, it is unnecessary to incur the slightest risk of loss through adverse business developments of any sort, since all these may be provided for in advance by means of a contingency reserve. The Special Committee has recommended that the corporation create such a contingency reserve in the fairly substantial amount of $1 billion. As previously set forth, the annual write-down of inventory of $1 will be absorbed by this reserve. To prevent eventual exhaustion of the contingency reserve, it has been further decided that it be replenished each year by transfer of an appropriate sum from capital surplus. Since the latter is expected to increase each year by not less than $250 million through the exercise of the stock option warrants, see 3 above, it will readily make good any drains on the contingency reserve. In setting up this arrangement, the Board of Directors must confess regretfully that they have been unable to improve upon the devices already employed by important corporations in transferring large sums between capital surplus, contingency reserves, and other balance sheet accounts. In fact, it must be admitted that our entries will be somewhat too simple and will lack the element of extreme mystification that characterizes the most advanced procedure in this field. The Board of Directors, however, have insisted upon clarity and simplicity in framing their modernization plan, even at the sacrifice of possible advantage to the corporation's earning power. In order to show the combined effect of the new proposals upon the corporation's earning power, we submit herewith a condensed income account for 1935 on 2 bases. Column A, as reported, earned per share negative $2.76. Column B, pro forma giving effect to changes proposed herewith, earned per share $49.80. In accordance with a somewhat antiquated custom, there is appended herewith a condensed pro forma balance sheet of the U.S. Steel Corporation as of December 31, 1935, after giving effect to proposed changes in asset and liability accounts. Total assets and liabilities total negative $774,999,999. It is perhaps unnecessary to point out to our stockholders that modern accounting methods give rise to balance sheets differing somewhat in appearance from those of a less advanced period. In view of the very large earning power that will result from these changes in the corporation's balance sheet, It is not expected that undue attention will be paid to the details of assets and liabilities. In conclusion, the board desires to point out that the combined procedure whereby plant will be carried at a minus figure, our wage bill will be eliminated, and inventory will stand on our books at virtually nothing, will give U.S. Steel Corporation an enormous competitive advantage in the industry. We shall be able to sell our products at exceedingly low prices and still show a handsome profit margin. It is the considered view of the Board of Directors that under the modernization scheme, we shall be able to undersell all competitors to such a point that the antitrust laws will constitute the only barrier to 100% domination of the industry. In making this statement, the Board is not unmindful of the possibility that some of our competitors may seek to offset our new advantages by adopting similar accounting improvements. We are confident, however, that U.S. Steel will be able to retain the loyalty of its customers, old and new, through the unique prestige that will accrue to it as the originator and pioneer in these new fields of service to the user of steel. Should necessity arise, moreover, we believe we shall be able to maintain our deserved superiority by introducing still more advanced bookkeeping methods, which are even now under development in our experimental accounting laboratory. B. Standard setting. A few decades ago, an Arthur Andersen audit opinion was the gold standard of the profession. Within the firm, an elite professional standards group, PSG, insisted on honest reporting no matter what pressures were applied by the client. Sticking to these principles, the PSG took a stand in 1992 that the cost of stock options should be recorded as the expense it clearly was. The PSG's position was reversed, however, by the rainmaking partners of Andersen, who knew what their clients wanted, higher reported earnings no matter what the reality. Many CEOs also fought expensing because they knew that the obscene mega grants of options they craved would be slashed if the true costs of these had to be recorded. Soon after the Andersen reversal, the Independent Accounting Standards Board, FASB, voted 7-0 for expensing options. Predictably, the major auditing firms and an army of CEOs stormed Washington to pressure the Senate, what better institution to decide accounting questions, into castrating the FASB. The voices of the protesters were amplified by their large political contributions, usually made with corporate money belonging to the very owners about to be bamboozled. It was not a sight for a civics class. To its shame, the Senate voted 88-9 against expensing. Several prominent senators even called for the demise of the FASB if it didn't abandon its position. So much for independence. Arthur Levitt Jr., then chairman of the SEC, and generally a vigilant champion of shareholders, has since described his reluctant bowing to the congressional and corporate pressures as the act of his chairmanship that he most regrets. The details of this sordid affair are related in Levitt's excellent book, Take on the Street. With the Senate in its pocket and the SEC outgunned, corporate America knew that it was now boss when it came to accounting. With that, a new era of anything-goes earnings reports, blessed and, in some cases, encouraged by big-name auditors, was launched. The licentious behavior that followed quickly became an air pump for the Great Bubble. After being threatened by the Senate, FASB backed off its original position and adopted an honor system approach, declaring expensing to be preferable but also allowing companies to ignore the cost if they wished. The disheartening result? Of the 500 companies in the S&P, 498 adopted the method deemed less desirable, which of course let them report higher earnings. Compensation-hungry CEOs loved this outcome. Let FASB have the honor. They had the system. Stock options. The most egregious case of let's not face up to reality behavior by executives and accountants has occurred in the world of stock options. In Berkshire's 1985 annual report, I laid out my opinions about the use and misuse of options. But even when options are structured properly, they are accounted for in ways that make no sense. The lack of logic is not accidental. For decades, much of the business world has waged war against accounting rule-makers trying to keep the costs of stock options from being reflected in the profits of the corporations that issue them. Typically, executives have argued that options are hard to value and that therefore their costs should be ignored. At other times, managers have said that assigning a cost to options would injure small startup businesses. Sometimes they have even solemnly declared that out-of-the-money options, those with an exercise price equal to or above the current market price, have no value when they are issued. Oddly, the Council of Institutional Investors has chimed in with a variation on that theme, opining that options should not be viewed as a cost because they aren't dollars out of money's coffers. I see this line of reasoning as offering exciting possibilities to American corporations for instantly improving their reported profits. For example, they could eliminate the cost of insurance by paying for it with options. So if you're a CEO and subscribe to this no cash, no cost theory of accounting, I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. Give us a call at Berkshire and we will happily sell you insurance in exchange for a bundle of long-term options on your company's stock. Shareholders should understand that companies incur costs when they deliver something of value to another party and not just when cash changes hands. Moreover, it is both silly and cynical to say that an important item of cost should not be recognized simply because it can't be quantified with pinpoint precision. Right now, accounting abounds with imprecision. After all, no manager or auditor knows how long a 747 is going to last, which means he also does not know what the yearly depreciation charge for the plane should be. No one knows with any certainty what a bank's annual loan loss charge ought to be. And the estimates of losses that property casualty companies make are notoriously inaccurate. Does this mean that these important items of cost should be ignored simply because they can't be quantified with absolute accuracy? Of course not. Rather, these costs should be estimated by honest and experienced people and then recorded. When you get right down to it, what other item of major but hard to precisely calculate cost, other that is than stock options, does the accounting profession say should be ignored in the calculation of earnings? Moreover, options are just not that difficult to value. Admittedly, the difficulty is increased by the fact that the options given to executives are restricted in various ways. These restrictions affect value. They do not, however, eliminate it. In fact, since I'm in the mood for offers, I'll make one to any executive who is granted a restricted option, even though it may be out of the money. On the day of issue, Berkshire will pay him or her a substantial sum for the right to any future gain he or she realizes on the option. So if you find a CEO who says his newly issued options have little or no value, tell him to try us out. In truth, we have far more confidence in our ability to determine an appropriate price to pay for an option than we have in our ability to determine the proper depreciation rate for a corporate jet. The accounting profession and the SEC should be shamed by the fact that they have long let themselves be muscled by business executives on the option accounting issue. Additionally, the lobbying that executives engage in may have an unfortunate byproduct. In my opinion, the business elite risks losing its credibility on issues of significance to society, about which it may have much of value to say, when it advocates the incredible on issues of significance to itself. Our General Re acquisition put a spotlight on an egregious flaw in accounting procedure. Sharp-eyed shareholders reading our proxy statement probably noticed an unusual item on page 60. In the pro forma statement of income, which detailed how the combined 1997 earnings of the two entities would have been affected by the merger, there was an item stating that compensation expense would have been increased by $63 million. This item, we hasten to add, does not signal that either Charlie or I have experienced a major personality change. He still travels coach and quotes Ben Franklin. Nor does it indicate any shortcoming in General Re's accounting practices, which have followed GAAP to the letter. Instead, the pro forma adjustment came about because we are replacing General Re's long-standing stock option plan with a cash plan that ties the incentive compensation of General Re managers to their operating achievements. Formerly, what counted for these managers was General Re's stock price. Now their payoff will come from the business performance they deliver. The new plan and the terminated option arrangement have matching economics, which means that the rewards they deliver to employees should, for a given level of performance, be the same. but what these people could have formerly anticipated earning from new option grants will now be paid in cash. Options granted in past years remain outstanding. Though the two plans are an economic wash, the cash plan we are putting in will produce a vastly different accounting result. This Alice in Wonderland outcome occurs because existing accounting principles ignore the cost of stock options when earnings are being calculated, even though options are a huge and increasing expense at a great many corporations. In effect, accounting principles offer management a choice: pay employees in one form and count the cost, or pay them in another form and ignore the cost. Small wonder, then, that the use of options has mushroomed. This lopsided choice has a big downside for owners, however. Though options, if properly structured, can be an appropriate and even ideal way to compensate and motivate top managers, they are more often wildly capricious in their distribution of rewards, inefficient as motivators, and inordinately expensive for shareholders. Whatever the merits of options may be, their accounting treatment is outrageous. Think for a moment of the hundreds of millions we spend for advertising at Geico each year. Suppose that instead of paying cash for our ads, we paid the media in 10-year at-the-market Berkshire options. Would anyone then care to argue that Berkshire had not borne a cost for advertising, or should not be charged this cost on its books? Perhaps Bishop Berkeley, you may remember him as the philosopher who mused about trees falling in a forest when no one was around, would believe that an expense unseen by an accountant does not exist. Charlie and I, however, have trouble being philosophical about unrecorded costs. When we consider investing in an option-issuing company, we make an appropriate downward adjustment to reported earnings, simply subtracting an amount equal to what the company could have realized by publicly selling options of like quantity and structure. Similarly, if we contemplate an acquisition, we include in our evaluation the cost of replacing any option plan. Then, if we make a deal, we promptly take that cost out of hiding. Readers who disagree with me about options will by this time be mentally quarreling with my equating the cost of options issued to employees with those that might theoretically be sold and traded publicly. It is true, to state one of these arguments, that employee options are sometimes forfeited. That lessens the damage done to shareholders, whereas publicly offered options would not be. It is true also that companies receive a tax deduction when employee options are exercised. Publicly traded options deliver no such benefit. But there's an offset to these points. Options issued to employees are often repriced, a transformation that makes them much more costly than the public variety. It's sometimes argued that a non-transferable option given to an employee is less valuable to him than would be a publicly traded option that he could freely sell. That fact, however, does not reduce the cost of the non-transferable option. Giving an employee a company car that can only be used for certain purposes diminished its value to the employee, but does not in the least diminish its cost to the employer. The earning revisions that Charlie and I have made for options in recent years have frequently cut the reported per-share figures by 5%, with 10% not all that uncommon. On occasion, the downward adjustment has been so great that it has affected our portfolio decisions, causing us either to make a sale or to pass on a stock purchase we might otherwise have made. A few years ago, we asked 3 questions to which we have not yet received an answer. If options aren't a form of compensation, what are they? If compensation isn't an expense, what is it? And if expenses shouldn't go into the calculation of earnings, where in the world should they go? Because the attempts to obfuscate the stock option issue continue, it's worth pointing out that no one, neither the FASB nor investors generally, nor I, are talking about restricting the use of options in any way. Indeed, my successor at Berkshire may well receive much pay via options, albeit logically structured ones in respect to 1. An appropriate strike price, 2. An escalation in price that reflects the retention of earnings, and 3. A ban on his quickly disposing of any shares purchased through options. We cheer arrangements that motivate managers, whether these be cash bonuses or options. And if a company is truly receiving value for the options it issues, we see no reason why recording their costs should cut down on their use. Restructuring charges. The role that managements have played in stock option accounting has hardly been benign. A distressing number of both CEOs and auditors have in recent years bitterly fought FASB's attempts to replace option fiction with truth, and virtually none have spoken out in support of FASB. If opponents even enlisted Congress in the fight, pushing the case that inflated figures were in the national interest. Still, I believe that the behavior of managements has been even worse when it comes to restructurings and merger accounting. Here, many managements purposefully work at manipulating numbers and deceiving investors. And, as Michael Kinsley has said about Washington, the scandal isn't in what's done that's illegal, but rather in what's legal. It was once relatively easy to tell the good guys in accounting from the bad. The late 1960s, for example, brought on an orgy of what one charlatan dubbed bold, imaginative accounting, the practice of which incidentally made him loved for a time by Wall Street because he never missed expectations. But most investors of that period knew who was playing games, and, to their credit, virtually all of America's most admired companies then shunned deception. In recent years, probity has eroded. Many major corporations still play things straight, but a significant and growing number of otherwise high-grade managers, CEOs you would be happy to have as spouses for your children or as trustees under your will, have come to the view that it's okay to manipulate earnings to satisfy what they believe are Wall Street's desires. Indeed, many CEOs think this kind of manipulation is not only okay, but actually their duty. These managers start with the assumption, all too common, that their job at all times is to encourage the highest stock price possible, a premise with which we adamantly disagree. To pump the price, they strive admirably for operational excellence. But when operations don't produce the result hoped for, these CEOs resort to unadmirable accounting stratagems. These either manufacture the desired earnings or set the stage for them in the future. Rationalizing this behavior, these managers often say that their shareholders will be hurt if their currency for doing deals, that is, their stock, is not fully priced, and they also argue that in using accounting shenanigans to get the figures they want, they are only doing what everybody else does. Once such an everybody's doing it attitude takes hold, ethical misgivings vanish. Call this behavior son of Gresham, bad accounting drives out good. The distortion du jour is the restructuring charge, an accounting entry that can, of course, be legitimate, but that too often is a device for manipulating earnings. In this bit of ledger domain, a large chunk of costs that should properly be attributed to a number of years is dumped into a single quarter, typically one already fated to disappoint investors. In some cases, the purpose of the charge is to clean up earnings misrepresentations of the past, and in others, it is to prepare the ground for future misrepresentations. In either case, the size and timing of these charges is dictated by the cynical proposition that Wall Street will not mind if earnings fall short by $5 per share in a given quarter, just as long as this deficiency ensures that quarterly earnings in the future will consistently exceed expectations by 5 cents per share. This dump everything into one quarter behavior suggests a corresponding bold, imaginative approach to golf scores. In his first round of the season, a golfer should ignore his actual performance and simply fill his card with atrocious numbers, double, triple, quadruple bogeys, and then turn in a score of, say, 140. Having established this reserve, he should go to the golf shop and tell his pro that he wishes to restructure his imperfect swing. Next, as he takes his new swing onto the course, he should count his good holes, but not the bad ones. These remnants from his old swing should be charged instead to the reserve established earlier. At the end of 5 rounds, then, his record will be 140, 80, 80, 80, 80, rather than 91, 94, 89, 94, 92. On Wall Street, they will ignore the 140, which, after all, came from a discontinued swing, and will classify our hero as an 80 shooter, and one who never disappoints. For those who prefer to cheat up front, there would be a variant of this strategy. The golfer, playing alone with a cooperative caddy auditor, should defer the recording of bad holes, take 4 80s, accept the plaudits he gets for such athleticism and consistency, and then turn in a 5th card carrying a 140 score. After rectifying his earlier scorekeeping sins with this big bath, he may mumble a few apologies but will refrain from returning the sums he has previously collected from comparing scorecards in the clubhouse. The caddy, need we add, will have acquired a loyal patron. Unfortunately, CEOs who use variations of these scoring schemes in real life tend to become addicted to the games they're playing. After all, it's easier to fiddle with the scorecard than to spend hours on the practice tee and never muster the will to give them up. Their behavior brings to mind Voltaire's comment on sexual experimentation: once a philosopher, twice a pervert. In the acquisition arena, restructuring has been raised to an art form. Managements now frequently use mergers to dishonestly rearrange the value of assets and liabilities in ways that will allow them to both smooth and swell future earnings. Indeed, at deal time, major auditing firms sometimes point out the possibilities for a little accounting magic, or for a lot. Getting this push from the pulpit, first-class people will frequently stoop to third-class tactics. CEOs understandably do not find it easy to reject auditor-blessed strategies that lead to increased future earnings. An example from the property casualty insurance industry will illuminate the possibilities. When a PC company is acquired, the buyer sometimes simultaneously increases its loss reserves, often substantially. This boost may merely reflect the previous inadequacy of reserves, though it is uncanny how often an actuarial revelation of this kind coincides with the inking of a deal. In any case, the move sets up the possibility of earnings flowing into income at some later date as reserves are released. Berkshire has kept entirely clear of these practices. If we are to disappoint you, we would rather it be with our earnings than with our accounting. In all of our acquisitions, we have left the loss reserve figures exactly as we found them. After all, we have consistently joined with insurance managers knowledgeable about their business and honest in their financial reporting. When deals occur in which liabilities are increased immediately and substantially, simple logic says that at least one of those virtues must have been lacking, or, alternatively, that the acquirer is laying the groundwork for future infusions of earnings. Here's a true story that illustrates an all-too-common view in corporate America. The CEOs of two large banks, one of them a man who'd make any acquisitions, were involved not long ago in a friendly merger discussion which in the end didn't produce a deal. The veteran acquirer was expounding on the merits of the possible combination, only to be skeptically interrupted by the other CEO. "But won't that mean a huge charge?" he asked, "perhaps as much as $1 billion? The sophisticate wasted no words. "We'll make it bigger than that. That's why we're doing the deal." A preliminary tally by R.G. Associates of Baltimore of special charges taken or announced during 1998, that is, charges for restructuring, in-process R&D, merger-related items, and write-downs, identified no less than 1,369 of these, totaling $72.1 billion. That is a staggering amount as evidenced by this bit of perspective. The 1997 earnings of the 500 companies in Fortune's famous list totaled $324 billion. Clearly, the attitude of disrespect that many executives have today for accurate reporting is a business disgrace. And auditors, as we have already suggested, have done little on the positive side. Though auditors should regard the investing public as their client, they tend to kowtow instead to the managers who choose them and dole out their pay. Whose bread I eat, his song I sing. Pension estimates and retiree benefits. Shenanigans often result from the inherent discretion that accounting standards grant managers. Consider the investment return assumption a company uses in calculating pension expense. It will come as no surprise that many companies continue to choose an assumption that allows them to report less than solid earnings. For the 363 companies in the S&P that have pension plans, this assumption in 2006 averaged 8%. Let's look at the chances of that being achieved. The average holdings of bonds and cash for all pension funds is about 28%, and on these assets returns can be expected to be no more than 5%. Higher yields, of course, are obtainable, but they carry with them a risk of commensurate or greater loss. This means that the remaining 72% of assets, which are mostly in equities, either held directly or through vehicles such as hedge funds or private equity investments, must earn 9.2% in order for the fund overall to achieve the postulated 8%. And that return must be delivered after all fees, which are now far higher than they have ever been. How realistic is this expectation? During the 20th century, the Dow advanced from 66 to 11,497. This gain, though it appears huge, shrinks to 5.3% when compounded annually. An investor who owned the Dow throughout the century would also have received generous dividends for much of the period, but only about 2% or so in the final years. It was a wonderful century. Think now about this century. For investors to merely match that 5.3% market value gain, the Dow, recently below 13,000, would need to close at about 2 million on December 31, 2099. We are now 8 years into this century, and we have racked up less than 2,000 of the 1,988,000 Dow points the market needed to travel in this 100 years to equal the 5.3% of the last. It's amusing that commentators regularly hyperventilate at the prospect of the Dow crossing an even number of thousands, such as 14,000 or 15,000. If they keep reacting that way, a 5.3% annual gain for the century will mean they experience at least 1,986 seizures during the next 92 years. While anything is possible, does anyone really believe this is the most likely outcome? Dividends continue to run about 2%. Even if stocks were to average the 5.3% annual appreciation of the 1900s, the equity portion of plan assets, allowing for expenses of 0.5%, would produce no more than 7% or so. And 0.5% may well understate costs given the presence of layers of consultants and high-priced managers, helpers. Naturally, everyone expects to be above average. And those helpers, bless their hearts, will certainly encourage their clients in this belief. But as a class, the helper-aided group must be below average. The reason is simple. 1. Investors overall will necessarily earn an average return minus costs they incur. 2. Passive and index investors, through their very inactivity, will earn that average minus costs that are very low. 3. With that group earning average returns, so must the remaining group, the active investors. But this group will incur high transaction, management, and advisory costs. Therefore, the active investor will have their returns diminished by a far greater percentage than will their inactive brethren. That means that the passive group, the know-nothings, must win. I should mention that people who expect to earn 10% annually from equities during this century, envisioning that 2% of that will come from dividends and 8% from price appreciation, are implicitly forecasting a level of about 24 million on the Dow by 2100. If your advisor talks to you about double-digit returns from equities, explain this math to him, not that it will faze him. Many helpers are apparently direct descendants of the Queen in Alice in Wonderland, who said, "Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." Beware the glib helper who fills your head with fantasies while he fills his pockets with fees. Some companies have pension plans in Europe as well in the US, and in their accounting, almost all assume that the US plans will earn more than the non-US plans. This discrepancy is puzzling. Why should these companies not put their US managers in charge of the non-US pension assets and let them work their magic on these assets as well? I've never seen this puzzle explained, but the auditors and actuaries who are charged with vetting the return assumptions seem to have no problem with it. An accounting change that took effect in 1993 mandates that businesses recognize their present value liability for post-retirement health benefits. Though GAAP has previously required recognition of pensions to be paid in the future, it has illogically ignored the cost that companies will then have to bear for health benefits. The new rule will force many companies to record a huge balance sheet liability and a consequent reduction in net worth, and also henceforth to recognize substantially higher costs when they are calculating annual benefits. In recent decades, no CEO would have dreamed of going to his board with the proposition that his company become an insurer of uncapped post-retirement health benefits that other corporations choose to install. A CEO didn't need to be a medical expert to know that lengthening life expectations and soaring health costs would guarantee an insurer a financial battering from such a business. Nevertheless, many a manager blithely committed his own company to a self-insurance plan embodying precisely the same promises, and thereby doomed his shareholders to suffer the inevitable consequences. In healthcare, open-minded promises have created open-ended liabilities that in a few cases loom so large as to threaten the global competitiveness of major American industries. I believe part of the reason for this reckless behavior was that accounting rules did not, for so long, require the booking of post-retirement health costs as they were incurred. Instead, the rules allowed cash-basis accounting, which vastly understated the liabilities that were building up. In effect, the attitude of both managements and their accountants toward these liabilities was out of sight, out of mind. Ironically, some of these same managers would be quick to criticize Congress for employing cash-basis thinking in respect to Social Security promises or other programs creating future liabilities of size. Managers thinking about accounting issues should never forget one of Abraham Lincoln's favorite riddles. How many legs does a dog have if you call his tail a leg? The answer, 4, because calling a tail a leg does not make it a leg. It behooves managers to remember that Abe's right even if an auditor is willing to certify that the tail is a leg. Realization events. Let's focus on a number that many in the media feature above all others, net income. Important though that number may be at most companies, it is almost always meaningless at Berkshire. Regardless of how our businesses might be doing, Charlie and I could, quite legally, cause net income in any given period to be almost any number we would like. We have that flexibility because realized gains or losses on investments go into the net income figure, whereas unrealized gains, and in most cases losses, are excluded. For example, imagine that Berkshire had a $10 billion increase in unrealized gains in a given year and concurrently had $1 billion of realized losses. Our net income, which would count only the loss, would be reported as less than our operating income. If we had meanwhile realized gains in the previous year, headlines might proclaim that our earnings were down X%, when in reality our business might have much improved. If we really thought net income important, we could regularly feed realized gains into it simply because we have a huge amount of unrealized gains upon which to draw. Rest assured, though, that Charlie and I have never sold a security because of the effect a sale would have on the net income we were soon to report. We both have a deep disgust for game playing with numbers, a practice that was rampant throughout corporate America in the 1990s and still persists, though it occurs less frequently and less blatantly than it used to. Operating earnings, despite having some shortcomings, are in general a reasonable guide as to how our businesses are doing. Ignore our net income figure, however. Regulations require that we report it to you. But if you find reporters focusing on it, that will speak more to their performance than ours. Both realized and unrealized gains and losses are fully reflected in the calculation of our book value. Pay attention to the changes in that metric and to the course of our operating earnings, and you will be on the right track. Taxation. We would owe taxes of many billions were we to sell all of our securities at year-end market values. Is this liability equal or even similar to a liability payable to a trade creditor 15 days after the end of the year? Obviously not, despite the fact that both items have exactly the same effect on audited net worth. On the other hand, is this liability for deferred taxes a meaningless accounting fiction because its payment can be triggered only on the sale of stocks that, in very large part, we have no intention of selling? Again, the answer is no. In economic terms, the liability resembles an interest-free loan from the U.S. Treasury that comes due only at our election, unless, of course, Congress moves to tax gains before they are realized. This loan is peculiar in other respects as well. It can be used only to finance the ownership of the particular appreciated stocks, and it fluctuates in size, daily as market prices change and periodically if tax rates change. In effect, this deferred tax liability is equivalent to a very large transfer tax that is payable only if we elect to move from one asset to another. Because of the way the tax law works, the Rip Van Winkle style of investing that we favor, if successful, has an important mathematical edge over a more frenzied approach. We have not, we should stress, adopted our strategy favoring long-term investment commitments because of these mathematics. Indeed, it is possible we could earn greater after-tax returns by moving rather frequently from one investment to another. Many years ago, that's exactly what Charlie and I did. Now we would rather stay put, even if that means slightly lower returns. Our reason is simple. We have found splendid business relationships to be so rare and so enjoyable that we want to retain all we develop. This decision is particularly easy for us because we feel that these relationships will produce good, though perhaps not optimal, financial results. Considering that, we think it makes little sense for us to give up time with people we know to be interesting and admirable for time with others we do not know and who are likely to have human qualities far closer to average. Distribution of the corporate tax burden. Over the years, there has been a lot of fuzzy and often partisan commentary about who really pays corporate taxes, businesses or their customers. The argument, of course, has usually turned around tax increases, not decreases. These people resisting increases in corporate tax rates frequently argue that corporations in reality pay none of the taxes levied on them, but instead act as a sort of economic pipeline, passing all taxes through to consumers. According to these advocates, any corporate tax increase will simply lead to higher prices that, for the corporation, offset the increase. Having taken this position, proponents of the pipeline theory must also conclude that a tax decrease for corporations will not help profits, but will instead flow through, leading to correspondingly lower prices for consumers. Conversely, others argue that corporations not only pay the taxes levied upon them, but absorb them also. Consumers, this school says, will be unaffected by changes in corporate rates. What really happens? When the corporate rate is cut, do Berkshire, the Washington Post, Cap Cities, etc. themselves soak up the benefits, or do these companies pass the benefits along to their customers in the form of lower prices? This is an important question for investors and managers, as well for policymakers. Our conclusion is that in some cases the benefits of lower corporate taxes fall exclusively, or almost exclusively, upon the corporation and its shareholders, and that in other cases the benefits are entirely or almost entirely passed through to the customer. What determines the outcome is the strength of the corporation's business franchise and whether the profitability of the franchise is regulated. For example, when the franchise is strong and after-tax profits are regulated in a relatively precise manner, as is the case with electric utilities, changes in corporate tax rates are largely reflected in prices, not in profits. When taxes are cut, prices will usually be reduced in short order. When taxes are increased, prices will rise, though often not as promptly. A similar result occurs in a second arena, in the price-competitive industry, whose companies typically operate with very weak business franchises. In such industries, the free market regulates after-tax profits in a delayed and irregular but generally effective manner. The marketplace, in effect, performs much the same function in dealing with the price-competitive industry as the Public Utilities Commission does in dealing with electric utilities. In these industries, therefore, tax changes eventually affect prices more than profits. In the case of unregulated businesses blessed with strong franchises, however, it's a different story. The corporation and its shareholders are then the major beneficiaries of tax cuts. These companies benefit from a tax cut much as the electric company would if it lacked a regulator to force down prices. Many of our businesses, both those we own in whole and in part, possess such franchises. Consequently, reductions in their taxes largely end up in our pockets rather than the pockets of our customers. While this may be impolitic to state, it is impossible to deny. If you are tempted to believe otherwise, think for a moment of the most able brain surgeon or lawyer in your area. Do you really expect the fees of this expert, the local franchise holder in his or her specialty, to be reduced now that the top personal tax rate is being cut from 50% to 28%? But tax increases will affect profits of Berkshire's property casualty companies, even though they operate in an intensively price-competitive industry. The reason this industry is likely to be an exception to our general rule is that not all major insurers will be working with identical tax equations. Important differences will exist for several reasons. A new alternative minimum tax will materially affect some companies but not others. Certain major insurers will have huge loss carryforwards that will largely shield their income from significant taxes for at least a few years, and the results of some large insurers will be folded into the consolidated returns of companies with non-insurance businesses. These disparate conditions will produce widely varying marginal tax rates in the property casualty insurance industry. That will not be the case, however, in most other price-competitive industries, such as aluminum, autos, and department stores, in which the major players will generally contend with similar tax equations. The absence of a common tax calculus for property casualty companies means that the increased taxes falling on the industry will probably not be passed along to customers to the degree that they would in a typical price-competitive industry. Insurers, in other words, will themselves bear much of the new tax burdens. Berkshire's tax situation is sometimes misunderstood. First, capital gains have no special attraction for us. A corporation pays a 35% rate on taxable income, whether it comes from capital gains or from ordinary operations. This means that Berkshire's tax on a long-term capital gain is fully 75% higher than what an individual would pay on an identical gain. Some people harbor another misconception, believing that we can exclude 70% of all dividends we receive from our taxable income. Indeed, the 70% rate applies to most corporations and also applies to Berkshire in cases where we hold stocks in non-insurance subsidiaries. However, almost all of our equity investments are owned by our insurance companies, and in that case the exclusion is 59.5%. That still means $1 of dividends is considerably more value to us than $1 of ordinary income, but not to the degree often assumed. Taxation and investment philosophy. Berkshire is a substantial payer of federal income taxes. In aggregate, we will pay 1993 federal income taxes of $390 million, about $200 million of that attributable to operating earnings and $190 million to realized capital gains. Speaking for our own shares, Charlie and I have absolutely no complaint about these taxes. We know we work in a market-based economy that rewards our efforts far more bountifully than it does the efforts of those whose output is of equal or greater benefit to society. Taxation should, and does, partially redress this inequity, but we still remain extraordinarily well treated. Berkshire and its shareholders, in combination, would pay a much smaller tax if Berkshire operated a partnership or S corporation, two structures often used for business activities. For a variety of reasons, that's not feasible for Berkshire to do. However, the penalty our corporate form imposes is mitigated, though far from eliminated, by our strategy of investing for the long term. Charlie and I would follow a buy and hold policy even if we ran a tax-exempt institution. We think it the soundest way to invest, and it also goes down the grain of our personalities. A third reason to favor this policy, however, is the fact that taxes are due only when gains are realized. Through my favorite comic strip, Lil Abner, I got a chance during my youth to see the benefits of delayed taxes, though I missed the lesson at the time. Making his readers feel superior, Lil Abner bungled happily but moronically through life in Dogpatch. At one point, he became infatuated with a New York temptress, Appassionata Van Climax, but despaired of marrying her because he had only a single silver dollar and was interested solely in millionaires. Dejected, Abner took his problem to Old Man Mose, the font of all knowledge in Dogpatch. Said the sage, "Double your money 20 times and Appassionata will be yours. 1, 2, 4, 8, 1,048,576. My last memory of the strip is Abner entering a roadhouse, dropping his dollar into a slot machine, and hitting a jackpot that spilled money all over the floor. Meticulously following Moses' advice, Abner picked up $2 and went off to find his next double. Whereupon I dumped Abner and began reading Ben Graham. most clearly was overrated as a guru. Besides failing to anticipate Abner's slavish obedience to instructions, he also forgot about taxes. Had Abner been subject to the 35% federal tax rate that Berkshire pays, and had he managed one double annually, he would after 20 years only have accumulated $22,370. Indeed, had he kept on both getting his annual doubles and paying a 35% tax on each, he would have needed 7.5 years more to reach the $1 million required to win Appassionata. But what if Abner had instead put his dollar in a single investment and held it until it doubled the same 27.5 times? In that case, he would have realized about $200 million pre-tax, or after paying a $70 million tax in the final year, about $130 million after tax. For that, Appassionata would have crawled to Dogpatch. Of course, with 27.5 years having passed, how Appassionata would have looked to a fellow sitting on $130 million is another question. What this little tale tells us is that tax-paying investors will realize a far, far greater sum from a single investment that compounds internally at a given rate than from a succession of investments compounding at the same rate. But I suspect many Berkshire shareholders figured that out long ago. There's a powerful financial reason behind Berkshire's preference to acquire 100% of a business rather than a small fraction, and that has to do with taxes. The tax code makes Berkshire's owning 80% or more of a business far more profitable for us proportionally than our owning a smaller share. When a company we own all of earns $1 million after tax, the entire amount insures to our benefit. If the $1 million is upstreamed to Berkshire, we owe no tax on the dividend. And if the earnings are retained and we were to sell the subsidiary, not likely at Berkshire, for $1 million more than we paid for it, we would owe no capital gains tax. That's because our tax cost upon sale would include both what we paid for the business and all earnings it subsequently retained. Contrast that situation to what happens when we own an investment in a marketable security. There, if we own a 10% stake in a business earning $10 million after tax, our $1 million share of earnings is subject to additional state and federal taxes of 1. About $140,000 if it is distributed to us. Our tax rate on most dividends is 14%. Or 2. No less than $350,000 if the $1 million is retained and subsequently captured by us in the form of capital gain, on which our tax rate is usually about 35%, though it sometimes approaches 40%. We may defer paying the $350,000 by not immediately realizing our gain, but eventually we must pay the tax. In effect, the government is our partner twice when we own part of a business through a stock investment, but only once when we own at least 80%. On May 20, 2003, the Washington Post ran an op-ed piece by me that was critical of the Bush tax proposals. 13 days later, Pamela Olson, Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy at the U.S. Treasury, delivered a speech about new tax legislation saying, "That means a certain Midwestern oracle who, it must be noted, has played the tax code like a fiddle, is still safe retaining all his earnings." I think she was talking about me. Alas, my fiddle playing will not get me to Carnegie Hall or even to a high school recital. Berkshire, on your behalf and mine, will send the Treasury $3.3 billion for tax on its 2003 income, a sum equaling 2.5% of the total income tax paid by all U.S. corporations in fiscal 2003. In contrast, Berkshire's market valuation is about 1% of the value of all American corporations. Our payment will almost certainly place us among our country's top 10 taxpayers. Indeed, if only 540 taxpayers paid the amount Berkshire will pay, no other individual or corporation would have to pay anything to Uncle Sam. That's right, 290 million Americans and all other businesses would not have to pay a dime on income, Social Security, excise, or estate taxes to the federal government. Here's the math. Federal tax receipts, including Social Security receipts, in fiscal 2003 totaled $1.782 trillion, and 540 Berkshires, each paying $3.3 billion, would deliver the same $1.782 trillion. Our federal tax return for 2002, when we paid $1.75 billion, covered a mere 8,905 pages. As is required, we dutifully filed 2 copies of this return, creating a pile of paper 7 feet tall. At World Headquarters, our small band of 15.8 personnel, though exhausted, momentarily flushed with pride, Berkshire, we felt, was surely pulling its share of our country's fiscal load. I can understand why the Treasury is now frustrated with corporate America and prone to outbursts, but it should look to Congress and the administration for redress, not to Berkshire. Corporate income taxes in fiscal 2003 accounted for 7.4% of all federal tax receipts, down from a post-war peak of 32% in 1952. With one exception, 1983, last year's percentage is the lowest recovered since data was first published in 1934. Even so, tax breaks for corporations and their investors, particularly large ones, were a major part of the administration's 2002 and 2003 initiatives. If class warfare is being waged in America, my class is clearly winning. Today, many large corporations, run by CEOs whose fiddle-playing talents make your chairman look like he is all thumbs, pay nothing close to the stated federal tax rate of 35%. In 1985, Berkshire paid $132 million in federal income taxes, and all corporations paid $61 billion. The comparable amounts in 1995 were $286 million and $157 billion, respectively. And, as mentioned, we will pay about $3.3 billion for 2003, a year when all corporations paid $132 billion. We hope our taxes continue to rise in the future. It will mean we are prospering, but we also hope that the rest of corporate America antes up along with us. This might be a project for Miss Olson to work on. Berkshire at 50 and beyond. Berkshire is now a sprawling conglomerate constantly trying to sprawl further. Conglomerates, it should be acknowledged, have a terrible reputation with investors, and they richly deserve it. Let me first explain why they are in the doghouse, and then I will go on to describe why the conglomerate form brings huge and enduring advantages to Berkshire. Conglomerates and succession. Since I entered the business world, conglomerates have enjoyed several periods of extreme popularity, the silliest of which occurred in the late 1960s. The drill for conglomerate CEOs then was simple. By personality, promotion, or dubious accounting, and often by all three, these managers drove a fledgling conglomerate to, say, 20 times earnings, and then issued shares as fast as possible to acquire another business selling at 10 or so times earnings. They immediately applied pooling accounting to the acquisition, which, with not a dime's worth of change in the underlying businesses, automatically increased per-share earnings and used the rise as proof of managerial genius. They next explained to investors that this sort of talent justified the maintenance or even the enhancement of the acquirer's PE multiple, and finally, they promised to endlessly repeat this procedure and thereby create ever-increasing per-share earnings. Wall Street's love affair with this hocus-pocus intensified as the 1960s rolled by. The street's denizens are always ready to suspend disbelief when dubious maneuvers are used to manufacture rising per-share earnings, particularly if these acrobatics produce mergers that generate huge fees for investment bankers. Auditors willingly sprinkled their holy water on the conglomerates' accounting and sometimes even made suggestions as to how to further juice the numbers. For many, gushers of easy money washed away ethical sensitivities. Since the per-share earnings gains of an expanding conglomerate came from exploiting PE differences, its CEO had to search for businesses selling at low multiples of earnings. These, of course, were characteristically mediocre businesses with poor long-term prospects. This incentive to bottom fish usually led to a conglomerate's collection of underlying businesses becoming even junkier. That mattered little to investors. It was deal velocity and pooling accounting they looked to for increased earnings. The resulting firestorm of merger activity was fanned by an adoring press. Companies such as ITT, Litton Industries, Gulf and Western, and LTV were lionized, and their CEOs became celebrities. These once famous conglomerates are now long gone. As Yogi Berra said, every Napoleon meets his Watergate. Back then, accounting shenanigans of all sorts, many of them ridiculously transparent, were excused or overlooked. Indeed, having an accounting wizard at the helm of an expanding conglomerate was viewed as a huge plus. Shareholders in those instances would be sure that reported earnings would never disappoint, no matter how bad the operating realities of the business might become. In the late 1960s, I attended a meeting at which an acquisitive CEO bragged of his bold, imaginative accounting. Most of the analysts listening responded with approving nods, seeing themselves as having found a manager whose forecasts were certain to be met, whatever the business results might be. Eventually, however, the clock struck 12 and everything turned to pumpkins and mice. Once again, it became evident that business models based on the serial issuances of overpriced shares, just like chain letter models, most assuredly redistribute wealth but in no way create it. Both phenomena, nevertheless, periodically blossom in our country. They are every promoter's dream, though often they appear in a carefully crafted disguise. The ending is always the same. Money flows from the gullible to the fraudster, and with stocks, unlike chain letters, the sums hijacked can be staggering. So what do Charlie and I find so attractive about Berkshire's conglomerate structure? To put the case simply, if the conglomerate form is used judiciously, it is an ideal structure for maximizing long-term capital growth. One of the heralded virtues of capitalism is that it efficiently allocates funds. The argument is that markets will direct investment to promising businesses and deny it to those destined to wither. That is true. With all its excesses, market-driven allocation of capital is usually far superior to any alternative. Nevertheless, there are often obstacles to the rational movement of capital. A CEO with capital employed in a declining operation seldom elects to massively redeploy that capital into unrelated activities. A move of that kind would usually require that long-time associates be fired and mistakes be admitted. Moreover, it's unlikely that CEO would be the manager you would wish to handle the redeployment job, even if he or she was inclined to undertake it. At the shareholder level, taxes and frictional costs have weighed heavily on individual investors when they attempt to reallocate capital among businesses and industries. Even tax-free institutional investors face major costs as they move capital because they usually need intermediaries to do this job. A lot of mouths with expensive taste then clamor to be fed, among them investment bankers, accountants, consultants, lawyers, and such capital reallocators as leveraged buyout operators. Money shufflers don't come cheap. In contrast, a conglomerate such as Berkshire is perfectly positioned to allocate capital rationally and at minimal cost. Of course, form itself is no guarantee of success. We have made plenty of mistakes and we will make more. Our structural advantages, however, are formidable. At Berkshire, we can, without incurring taxes or much in the way of other costs, move huge sums from businesses that have limited opportunities for incremental investment to other sectors with greater promise. Moreover, we are free of historical biases created by lifelong association with a given industry and are not subject to pressures from colleagues having a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. That's important. If horses had controlled investment decisions, there would have been no auto industry. Another major advantage we possess is the ability to buy pieces of wonderful businesses, aka common stocks. That's not a course of action open to most managements. Over our history, this strategic alternative has proved to be very helpful. A broad range of options sharpens decision-making. The businesses we are offered by the stock market every day, in small pieces to be sure, are often far more attractive than the businesses we are concurrently being offered in their entirety. Additionally, the gains we've realized from marketable securities have helped us make certain large acquisitions that would otherwise have been beyond our financial capabilities. In effect, the world is Berkshire's oyster, a world offering us a range of opportunities far beyond those realistically open to most companies. We are limited, of course, to businesses whose economic prospects we can evaluate, and that's a serious limitation. Charlie and I have no idea what a great many companies will look like 10 years from now, but that limitation is much smaller than that borne by an executive whose experience has been confined to a single industry. On top of that, we can profitably scale to a far larger size than the many businesses that are constrained by the limited potential of the single industry in which they operate. Berkshire has one further advantage that has become increasingly important over the years. We are now the home of choice for the owners and managers of many outstanding businesses. Families that own successful businesses have multiple options when they contemplate sale. Frequently, the best decision is to do nothing. There are worse things in life than having a prosperous business that one understands well. But sitting tight is seldom recommended by Wall Street. Don't ask the barber whether you need a haircut. When one part of the family wishes to sell while others wish to continue, a public offering often makes sense. But when owners wish to cash out entirely, they usually consider one of two paths. The first is sale to a competitor who is salivating at the possibility of wringing synergies from the combining of two companies. This buyer invariably contemplates getting rid of large numbers of the seller's associates, the very people who have helped the owner build his business. A caring owner, however, and there are plenty of them, usually does not want to leave his longtime associates sadly singing the old country song, "She got the gold mine, I got the shaft." The second choice for sellers is the Wall Street buyer. For some years, these purchasers accurately called themselves leveraged buyout firms. When that term got a bad name in the early 1990s, remember RJR and Barbarians at the Gate? These buyers hastily relabeled themselves private equity. The name may have changed, but that was all. Equity is dramatically reduced, and debt is piled on in virtually all private equity purchases. Indeed, the amount that a private equity purchaser offers to the seller is in part determined by the buyer assessing the maximum amount of debt that can be placed on the acquired company. Later, if things go well and equity begins to build, leveraged buyout shops will often seek to re-leverage with new borrowings. They then typically use part of the proceeds to pay a huge dividend that drives equity sharply downward, sometimes even to a negative figure. In truth, equity is a dirty word for many private equity buyers. What they love is debt. And when interest rates are very low, these buyers can frequently pay top dollar. Later, the businesses will be resold, often to another leveraged buyer. In effect, the business becomes a piece of merchandise. Berkshire offers a third choice to the business owner who wishes to sell, a permanent home in which the company's people and culture will be retained, though occasionally management changes will be needed. Beyond that, any business we acquire dramatically increases its financial strength and ability to grow. Its days of dealing with banks and Wall Street analysts are also forever ended. Some sellers don't care about these matters, but when sellers do, Berkshire does not have a lot of competition. Sometimes pundits propose that Berkshire spin off certain of its businesses. These suggestions make no sense. Our companies are worth more as part of Berkshire than as separate entities. One reason is our ability to move funds between businesses or into new ventures instantly and without tax. In addition, certain costs duplicate themselves in full or part if operations are separated. Here's the most obvious example. Berkshire incurs nominal costs for its single board of directors, where our dozens of subsidiaries to be split off, the overall cost for directors would soar. So too would regulatory and administrative expenditures. Finally, there are sometimes important tax efficiencies for subsidiary A because we own subsidiary B. For example, certain tax credits that are available to our utilities are currently realizable only because we generate huge amounts of taxable income at other Berkshire operations. That gives Berkshire Hathaway Energy a major advantage over most public utility companies in developing wind and solar projects. Investment bankers, being paid as they are for action, constantly urge acquirers to pay 20% to 50% premiums over market price for publicly held businesses. The bankers tell the buyer that the premium is justified for control value and for the wonderful things that are going to happen once the acquirer's COO takes charge. What acquisition-hungry manager will challenge that assertion? A few years later, bankers, bearing straight faces, again appear and just as earnestly urge spinning off the earlier acquisition in order to unlock shareholder value. Spin-offs, of course, strip the owning company of its purported control value without any compensating payment. The bankers explain that the spun-off company will flourish because its management will be more entrepreneurial, having been freed from the smothering bureaucracy of the parent company. So much for that talented CEO we met earlier. If the divesting company later wishes to reacquire the spun-off operation, it presumably would again be urged by its bankers to pay a hefty control premium for the privilege. Mental flexibility of this sort by the banking fraternity has prompted the saying that fees too often lead to transactions rather than transactions leading to fees. It's possible, of course, that someday a spin-off or sale at Berkshire would be required by regulators. Berkshire carried out such a spin-off in 1979 when new regulations for bank holding companies forced us to divest a bank we owned in Rockford, Illinois. Voluntary spin-offs, though, make no sense for us. We would lose control value, capital allocation flexibility, and, in some cases, important tax advantages. The CEOs who brilliantly run our subsidiaries now would have difficulty in being as effective if running a spun-off corporation, given the operating and financial advantages derived from Berkshire's ownership. Moreover, the parent and the spun-off operations, once separated, would likely incur moderately greater costs than existed when they were combined. Today, Berkshire possesses 1. An unmatched collection of businesses, most of them now enjoying favorable economic prospects. 2. A cadre of outstanding managers who, with few exceptions, are unusually devoted to both the subsidiary they operate and to Berkshire. 3. An extraordinary diversity of earnings, premier financial strength, and oceans of liquidity that we will maintain under all circumstances. 4. A first choice ranking among many owners and managers who are contemplating sale of their businesses. And 5. In a point related to the preceding item, a culture, distinctive in many ways from that of most large companies, that we have worked 50 years to develop and that is now rock solid. These strengths provide us a wonderful foundation on which to build. Now let's take a look at the road ahead. Bear in mind that if I had attempted 50 years ago to gauge what was coming, certain of my predictions would have been far off the mark. With that warning, I will tell you what I would say to my family today if they asked me about Berkshire's future. First and definitely foremost, I believe that the chance of permanent capital loss for patient Berkshire shareholders is as low as can be found among single company investments. That's because our per-share intrinsic business value is almost certain to advance over time. This cheery prediction comes, however, with an important caution. If an investor's entry point into Berkshire stock is unusually high at a price, say, approaching double book value, which Berkshire shares have occasionally reached, it may well be many years before the investor can realize a profit. In other words, a sound investment can morph into a rash speculation if it is bought at an elevated price. Berkshire is not exempt from this truth. Purchases of Berkshire that investors make at a price modestly above the level at which the company would repurchase its shares, however, should produce gains within a reasonable period of time. Berkshire's directors will only authorize repurchases at a price they believe to be well below intrinsic value. In our view, that is an essential criterion for repurchases that is often ignored by other managements. For those investors who plan to sell within a year or two after their purchases, I can offer no assurances, whatever the entry price. Movements of the general stock market during such abbreviated periods will likely be far more important in determining your results than the concomitant change in the intrinsic value of your Berkshire shares. Since I know of no way to reliably predict market movements, I recommend that you purchase Berkshire shares only if you expect to hold them for at least 5 years. Those who seek short-term profits should look elsewhere. Another warning: Berkshire shares should not be purchased with borrowed money. There have been 3 times since 1965 when our stock has fallen about 50% from its high point. Someday, something close to this kind of drop will happen again, and no one knows when. Berkshire will almost certainly be a satisfactory holding for investors, but it could well be a disastrous choice for speculators employing leverage. I believe the chance of any event causing Berkshire to experience financial problems is essentially zero. We will always be prepared for the 1,000-year flood. In fact, if it occurs, we will be selling life jackets to the unprepared. Berkshire played an important role as a first responder during the 2008 to 2009 meltdown, and we have since more than doubled the strength of our balance sheet and our earnings potential. Your company is the Gibraltar of American business and will remain so. Financial staying power requires a company to maintain 3 strengths under all circumstances. 1. A large and reliable stream of earnings. 2. Massive liquid assets. And 3. No significant near-term cash requirements. Ignoring that last necessity is what usually leads companies to experience unexpected problems. Too often, CEOs of profitable companies feel they will always be able to refund maturing obligations, however large these are. In 2008 to 2009, many managements learned how perilous that mindset can be. Here's how we will always stand on the three essentials. First, our earnings stream is huge and comes from a vast array of businesses. Our shareholders now own many large companies that have durable competitive advantages, and we will acquire more of those in the future. Our diversification assures Berkshire's continued profitability, even if a catastrophe causes insurance losses that far exceed any previously experienced. Next up is cash. At a healthy business, cash is sometimes thought of as something to be minimized as an unproductive asset that acts as a drag on such markets as a return on equity. Cash, though, is to a business as oxygen is to an individual, never thought about when it is present, the only thing in mind when it is absent. American business provided a case study of that in 2008. In September of that year, many long, prosperous companies suddenly wondered whether their checks would bounce in the days ahead. Overnight, their financial oxygen disappeared. At Berkshire, our breathing went uninterrupted. Indeed, in a 3-week period spanning late September and early October, we supplied $15.6 billion of fresh money to American businesses. We could do that because we always maintain at least $20 billion, and usually far more, in cash equivalents. And by that we mean U.S. Treasury bills, not other substitutes for cash that are claimed to deliver liquidity and actually do so, except when it is truly needed. When bills come due, only cash is legal tender. Don't leave home without it. Finally, getting to our third point, we will never engage in operating or investment practices that can result in sudden demands for large sums. That means we will not expose Berkshire to short-term debt maturities of size, nor enter into derivative contracts or other business arrangements that could require large collateral calls. Some years ago, we became a party to certain derivative contracts that we believed were significantly mispriced and that had only minor collateral requirements. These have proved to be quite profitable. Recently, however, newly written derivative contracts have required full collateralization, and that ended our interest in derivatives regardless of what profit potential they may offer. We have not, for some years, written these contracts except for a few needed for operational purchases at our utility businesses. Moreover, we will not write our insurance contracts that give policyholders the right to cash out at their option. Many life insurance products contain redemption features that make them susceptible to a run in times of extreme panic. Contracts of that sort, however, do not exist in the property casualty world that we inhabit. If our premium volume would shrink, our float would decline, but only at a very slow pace. The reason for our conservatism, which may impress some people as extreme, is that it is entirely predictable that people will occasionally panic, but not at all predictable when this will happen. Though practically all days are relatively uneventful, tomorrow is always uncertain. I felt no special apprehension on December 6, 1941 or September 10, 2001. And if you can't predict what tomorrow will bring, you must be prepared for whatever it does. A CEO who is 64 and plans to retire at 65 may have his own special calculus in evaluating risks that have only a tiny chance of happening in a given year. He may, in fact, be right 99% of the time. Those odds, however, hold no appeal for us. We will never play financial Russian roulette with the funds you've entrusted to us, even if the metaphorical gun has 100 chambers and only one bullet. In our view, it is madness to risk losing what you need in pursuing what you simply desire. Despite our conservatism, I think we will be able every year to build the underlying per-share earning power of Berkshire. That does not mean operating earnings will increase each year, far from it. The U.S. economy will ebb and flow, though mostly flow, and when it weakens, so will our current earnings. But we will continue to achieve organic gains, make bolt-on acquisitions, and enter new fields. I believe, therefore, that Berkshire will annually add to its underlying earning power. In some years, the gains will be substantial, and at other times they will be minor. Markets, competition, and chance will determine when opportunities come our way. Through it all, Berkshire will keep moving forward, powered by the array of solid businesses we now possess and the new companies we will purchase. In most years, moreover, our country's economy will provide a strong tailwind for business. We are blessed to have the United States as our home field. The bad news is that Berkshire's long-term gains, measured by percentages, not by dollars, cannot be dramatic and will not come close to those achieved in the past 50 years. The numbers have become too big. I think Berkshire will outperform the average American company, but our advantage, if any, won't be great. Eventually, probably between 10 and 20 years from now, Berkshire's earnings and capital resources will reach a level that will not allow management to intelligently reinvest all of the company's earnings. At that time, our directors will need to determine whether the best method to distribute the excess earnings is through dividends, share repurchases, or both. If Berkshire shares are selling below intrinsic business value, massive repurchases will almost certainly be the best choice. You can be comfortable that your directors will make the right decision. No company will be more shareholder-minded than Berkshire. For more than 30 years, we have annually reaffirmed our shareholder principles printed in the prologue, always leading off with, "Although our form is corporate, our attitude is partnership." This covenant with you is etched in stone. We have an extraordinarily knowledgeable and business-oriented board of directors ready to carry out that promise of partnership. To further ensure continuation of our culture, I have suggested that my son, Howard, succeed me as a non-executive chairman. My only reason for this wish is to make change easier if the wrong CEO should ever be employed and there occurs a need for the chairman to move forcefully. I can assure you that this problem has a very low probability of arising at Berkshire, likely as low as at any public company. In my service on the boards of 19 public companies, however, I've seen how hard it is to replace a mediocre CEO if that person is also chairman. The deed usually gets done, but almost always very late. If elected, Howard will receive no pay and will spend no time at the job other than that required of all directors. He will simply be a safety valve to whom any director can go if he or she has concerns about the CEO and wishes to learn if other directors are expressing doubts as well. Should multiple directors be apprehensive, Howard's chairmanship will allow the matter to be promptly and properly addressed. Choosing the right CEO is all important and is a subject that commands much time at Berkshire board meetings. Managing Berkshire is primarily a job of capital allocation, coupled with the selection and retention of outstanding managers to caption our operating subsidiaries. Obviously, the job also requires the replacement of a subsidiary's CEO when that is called for. These duties require Berkshire's CEO to be a rational, calm, and decisive individual who has a broad understanding of business and good insights into human behavior. It's important as well that he knows his limits. Character is crucial. A Berkshire CEO must be all in for the company, not for himself. I'm using male pronouns to avoid awkward wording, but gender should never decide who becomes CEO. He can't help but earn money far in excess of any possible need for it. But it's important that neither ego nor avarice motivate him to reach for pay matching his most lavishly compensated peers, even if his achievements far exceed theirs. A CEO's behavior has a huge impact on managers down the line. If it's clear to them that shareholders' interests are paramount to him, they will, with few exceptions, also embrace that way of thinking. My successor will need one other particular strength, the ability to fight off the ABCs of business decay, which are arrogance, bureaucracy, and complacency. When these corporate cancers metastasize, even the strongest of companies can falter. The examples available to prove the point are legion, but to many friendships I will exhume only cases from the distant past. In their glory days, General Motors, IBM, Sears Roebuck, and U.S. Steel sat atop huge industries. Their strength seemed unassailable, but the destructive behavior I deplored above eventually led each of them to fall to depths that their CEOs and directors had not long before thought impossible. Their one-time financial strength and their historical earning power proved no defense. Only a vigilant and determined CEO can ward off such debilitating forces as Berkshire grows ever larger. He must never forget Charlie's plea. Tell me where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. If our non-economic values were to be lost, much of Berkshire's economic value would collapse as well. Tone at the top will be key to maintaining Berkshire's special culture. Fortunately, the structure our CEOs will need to be successful is firmly in place. The extraordinary delegation of authority is now existing at Berkshire as is the ideal antidote to bureaucracy. In an operating sense, Berkshire is not a giant company, but rather a collection of large companies. At headquarters, we have never had a committee, nor have we ever required our subsidiaries to submit budgets, though many use them as an important internal tool. We don't have a legal office nor departments that other companies take for granted. Human relations, public relations, investor relations, strategy, acquisitions, you name it. We do, of course, have an active audit function, no sense being a damned fool. To an unusual degree, however, we trust our managers to run their operations with a keen sense of stewardship. After all, they were doing exactly that before we acquired their businesses. With only occasional exceptions, furthermore, our trust produces better results than would be achieved by streams of directives, endless reviews, and layers of bureaucracy. Charlie and I try to interact with our managers in a manner consistent with what we would wish for if the positions were reversed. Our directors believe that our future CEOs should come from internal candidates whom the Berkshire board has grown to know well. Our directors also believe that an incoming CEO should be relatively young so that he or she can have a long run in the job. Berkshire will operate best if its CEOs average well over 10 years at the helm. It's hard to teach a new dog old tricks. And they are not likely to retire at 65 either, or have you noticed? In both Berkshire's business acquisitions and large, tailored investment moves, it is important that our counterparties be both familiar with and feel comfortable with Berkshire's CEO. Developing confidence of that sort and cementing relationships takes time. The payoff, though, can be huge. Both the board and I believe we now have the right person to succeed me as CEO, a successor ready to assume the job the day after I die or step down. In certain important respects, this person will do a better job than I am doing. Investments will always be of great importance to Berkshire and will be handled by several specialists. They will report to the CEO because their investment decisions in a broad way will need to be coordinated with Berkshire's operating and acquisition programs. Overall, though, our investment managers will enjoy great autonomy. In this area, too, we are in fine shape for decades to come. All told, Berkshire is ideally positioned for life after Charlie and I leave the scene. We have the right people in place, the right directors, managers, and prospective successors to those managers. Our culture, furthermore, is embedded throughout their ranks. Our system is also regenerative. To a large degree, both good and bad cultures self-select to perpetuate themselves. For very good reasons, business owners and operating managers with values similar to ours will continue to be attracted to Berkshire as a one-of-a-kind and permanent home. Munger on the Berkshire system. The management system and policies of Berkshire under Buffett, the Berkshire system, were fixed early. Berkshire would be a diffuse conglomerate averse only to activities about which it could not make useful predictions. The parent company would do almost all business through separately incorporated subsidiaries whose CEOs would operate with extreme autonomy. There would be almost nothing at conglomerate headquarters except a tiny office suite containing a chairman, a CFO, and a few assistants. Berkshire subsidiaries would always prominently include casualty insurers, which as a group would be expected to produce dependable underwriting gains while also producing a substantial float for investment. There would be no significant system-wide personnel system, stock option system, other incentive system, retirement system, or the like, because the subsidiaries would have their own systems, or often different. Berkshire's chairman would reserve only a few activities for himself. 1. Manage almost all security investments, with these normally residing in Berkshire's casualty insurers. 2. Choose all CEOs of important subsidiaries and fix their compensation and obtain from each a private recommendation for a successor. 3. Deploy most cash not needed in subsidiaries after they had increased their competitive advantage, with the ideal deployment being to acquire new subsidiaries. 4. Make himself promptly available for almost any contact wanted by any subsidiary's CEO and require almost no additional contact. 5. Write a long, logical, and useful letter for inclusion in his annual report designed as he would wish it to be if if he were only a passive shareholder and be available for hours of answering questions at annual shareholders' meetings. 6. Try to be an exemplar in a culture that would work well for customers, shareholders, and other constituents for a long time, both before and after his departure. 7. Reserve much time for quiet reading and thinking, particularly that which might advance his determined learning, no matter how old he became. And 8. Spend much time in enthusiastically admiring what others were accomplishing. New subsidiaries would usually be bought with cash, not newly issued stock. Berkshire would not pay dividends so long as more than $1 of market value for shareholders was being created by each dollar of retained earnings. In buying a new subsidiary, Berkshire would seek to pay a fair price for a good business that the chairman could understand. Berkshire would also want a good CEO in place, one expected to remain for a long time and to manage well without need for help from headquarters. In choosing CEOs of subsidiaries, Berkshire would try to secure trustworthiness, skill, energy, and love for the business and circumstances the CEO was in. As an important matter of preferred conduct, Berkshire would almost never sell a subsidiary. Berkshire would almost never transfer a subsidiary's CEO to another unrelated subsidiary. Berkshire would never force the CEO of a subsidiary to retire on account of mere age. Berkshire would have little debt outstanding as it tried to maintain virtually perfect creditworthiness under all conditions and easy availability of cash and credit for deployment in times presenting unusual opportunities. And Berkshire would always be user-friendly to a prospective seller of a large business. An offer of such a business would get prompt attention. No one but the chairman and one or two others at Berkshire would ever know about the offer if it did not lead to a transaction, and they would never tell outsiders about it. Both the elements of the Berkshire system and their collected size are quite unusual. No other large corporation I know of has half of such elements in place. How did Berkshire happen to get a corporate personality so different from the norm? Buffett, even when only 34 years old, controlled about 45% of Berkshire's shares and was completely trusted by all the other big shareholders. He could install whatever system he wanted, and he did so, creating the Berkshire system. Almost every element was chosen because Buffett believed that, under him, it would help maximize Berkshire's achievement. He was not trying to create a one-type-fits-all system for other corporations. Indeed, Berkshire subsidiaries were not required to use the Berkshire system in their own operations, and some flourished while using different systems. What was Buffett aiming at as he designed the Berkshire system? Over the years, I diagnosed several important themes. He wanted continuous maximization of the rationality, skills, and devotion of the most important people in the system, starting with himself. Win-win results everywhere, and gaining loyalty by giving it, for instance, decisions that maximized long-term results, seeking these from decision-makers who usually stayed long enough in place to bear the consequences of decisions, to minimize the bad effects that would almost inevitably come from a large bureaucracy at headquarters, to personally contribute, like Professor Ben Graham, to the spread of wisdom attained. When Buffett developed the Berkshire system, did he foresee all the benefits that followed? No. Buffett stumbled into some benefits through practice evolution. But when he saw useful consequences, he strengthened their causes. Why did Berkshire under Buffett do so well? Only 4 large factors occur to me. The constructive peculiarities of Buffett, the constructive peculiarities of the Berkshire system, good luck, and the weirdly intense, contagious devotion of some shareholders and other admirers, including some in the press. I believe all 4 factors were present and helpful, but the heavy freight was carried by the constructive peculiarities, the weird devotion, and their interactions. Buffett's decision to limit his activities to a few kinds and to maximize his attention to them, and to keep doing so for 50 years, was a lollapalooza. Buffett was, in effect, using the winning method of the famous basketball coach John Wooden, who won most regularly after he had learned to assign virtually all playing time to his 7 best players. That way, opponents always faced his best players instead of his second best. And with the extra playing time, the best players improved more than was normal. Buffett much out-Woodened Wooden because, in his case, the exercise of skill was concentrated in one person, not 7, and his skill improved and improved as he got older and older during 50 years instead of deteriorating like the skill of a basketball player does. Moreover, by concentrating so much power and authority in the often long-serving CEOs of important subsidiaries, Buffett was also creating strong wooden-type effects there. And such effects enhanced the skills of the CEOs and the achievements of the subsidiaries. Then, as the Berkshire system bestowed much desired autonomy on our many subsidiaries and their CEOs, and Berkshire became successful and well-known, these outcomes attracted both more and better subsidiaries into Berkshire, and better CEOs as well. And the better subsidiaries and CEOs then required less attention from headquarters, creating what is often called a virtuous circle. How well did it work out for Berkshire to always include casualty insurers as important subsidiaries? Marvelously well. Berkshire's ambitions were unreasonably extreme, and even so, it got what it wanted. Casualty insurers often invest in common stocks with a value accounting roughly to their shareholders' equity, as did Berkshire's insurance subsidiaries. And the S&P 500 index produced about 10% per annum pre-tax during the last 50 years, creating a significant tailwind. In the early decades of the Buffett era, common stocks within Berkshire's insurance subsidiaries greatly outperformed the index, exactly as Buffett expected. Later, when both the large size of Berkshire's stock holdings and income tax considerations caused the index-beating part of returns to fade to insignificance, perhaps not forever, other and better advantage came. Ajit Jain created out of nothing an immense reinsurance business that produced both a huge float and a large underwriting gain. All of Geico came into Berkshire, followed by a quadrupling of Geico's market share. The rest of Berkshire's insurance options hugely improved, largely by dint of reputational advantage, underwriting discipline, finding and staying with good niches, and recruiting and holding outstanding people. Later, as Berkshire's nearly unique and quite dependable corporate personality and large size became well known, its insurance subsidiaries got and seized many attractive opportunities, not available to others, to buy privately issued securities. Most of these securities had fixed maturities and produced outstanding results. Berkshire's marvelous outcome in insurance was not a natural result. Ordinarily, a casualty insurance business is a producer of mediocre results even when very well managed, and such results are of little use. Berkshire's better outcome was so astoundingly large that I believe that Buffett would now fail to recreate it if he returned to a small base while retaining his smarts and regaining his youth. Did Berkshire suffer from being a diffuse conglomerate? No, its opportunities were usefully enlarged by a widened area for operation. And bad effects, common elsewhere, were prevented by Buffett's skills. Why did Berkshire prefer to buy companies with cash instead of its own stock? It was hard to get anything in exchange for Berkshire stock that was as valuable as what was given up. Why did Berkshire's acquisition of companies outside the insurance business work out so well for Berkshire shareholders when the normal result in such acquisitions is bad for shareholders of the acquirer? Berkshire, by design, had methodological advantages to supplement its better opportunities. It never had the equivalent of a department of acquisitions under pressure to buy, and it never relied on advice from helpers sure to be prejudiced in favor of transactions. And Buffett held self-delusion at bay as he underclaimed expertise, while he knew better than most corporate executives what worked and what didn't in business, aided by his long experience as a passive investor. And finally, even when Berkshire was getting much better opportunities than most others, Buffett often displayed almost inhuman patience and seldom bought. For instance, during his first 10 years in control of Berkshire, Buffett saw one business, textiles, move close to death and 2 new businesses come in for a net gain of 1. What were the big mistakes made by Berkshire under Buffett? While mistakes of commission were common, almost all huge errors were in not making a purchase, including not purchasing Walmart stock when that was sure to work out enormously well. The errors of omission were of much importance. Berkshire's net worth would now be at least $50 billion higher if it had seized several opportunities it was not quite smart enough to recognize as virtually sure things. Would abnormally good results continue at Berkshire if Buffett were soon to depart? The answer is yes. Berkshire has in place in its subsidiaries much business momentum grounded in much durable competitive advantage. Moreover, its railroad and utility subsidiaries now provide much desirable opportunity to invest large sums in new fixed assets. And many subsidiaries are now engaged in making wise bolt-on acquisitions. Provided that most of the Berkshire system remains in place, the combined momentum and opportunity now present is so great that Berkshire will almost certainly remain a better-than-normal company for a very long time. Finally, consider whether Berkshire's great results over the last 50 years have implications that may prove useful elsewhere. The answer is plainly yes. In its early Buffett years, Berkshire had a big task ahead, turning a tiny stash into a large and useful company. And it solved that problem by avoiding bureaucracy and relying much on one thoughtful leader for a long, long time as he kept improving and brought in more people like himself. Compare this to a typical big corporation system with much bureaucracy at its headquarters and a long succession of CEOs who come in at about age 59, pause little thereafter for quiet thought, and are soon forced out by a fixed retirement age. I believe that versions of the Berkshire system should be tried more often elsewhere, and that the worst attributes of bureaucracy should much more often be treated like the cancers they so much resemble. Methuselah's estate. A fat wallet is the enemy of superior investment results, and Berkshire now has a massive net worth compared to when Charlie and I began to manage the company. Though there are as many good businesses as ever, it is useless for us to make purchases that are inconsequential in relation to Berkshire's capital. Given that, Berkshire's investment universe has shrunk dramatically. Nevertheless, we will stick with the approach that got us here and try not to relax our standards. Ted Williams, in The Story of My Life, explains why. My argument is, to be a good hitter, you've got to get a good ball to hit. It's the first rule in the book. If I have to bite at stuff that is out of my happy zone, I'm not a .344 hitter. I might only be a .250 hitter. Charlie and I agree, and will try to wait for opportunities that are well within our happy zone. We will continue to ignore political and economic forecasts, which are an expensive distraction for many investors and businessmen. 30 years ago, no one could have foreseen the huge expansion of the Vietnam War, wage and price controls, 2 oil shocks, the resignation of a president, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a one-day drop in the Dow of 508 points, or Treasury bill yields fluctuating between 2.8% and 17.4%. But, surprise, none of these blockbuster events made the slightest dent in Ben Graham's investment principles. Nor did they render unsound the negotiated purchases of fine businesses at sensible prices. Imagine the cost to us, then, if we had let a fear of unknowns cause us to defer or alter the deployment of capital. Indeed, we have usually made our best purchases when apprehensions about some macro event were at peak. Fear is the foe of the fattest, but the friend of the fundamentalist. A different set of major shocks is sure to occur in the next 30 years. We will neither try to predict these nor to profit from them. If we can identify businesses similar to those we have purchased in the past, external surprises will have little effect on our long-term results. We achieved our gains through the efforts of a superb corps of operating managers who get extraordinary results from some ordinary-appearing businesses. Casey Stengel described managing a baseball team as getting paid for home runs other fellows hit. That's my formula at Berkshire also. It's far better to own a significant portion of the Hope Diamond than 100% of a rhinestone, and the companies just mentioned easily qualify as rare gems. Best of all, we aren't limited to simply a few of this breed, but instead possess a growing collection. Stock prices will continue to fluctuate, sometimes sharply, and the economy will have its ups and downs. Over time, however, we believe it is highly probable that the sort of businesses we own will continue to increase in value at a satisfactory rate. As owners, you are naturally concerned about whether I will insist on continuing as CEO after I begin to fade, and, if so, how the board will handle that problem. That problem would not be unique to me. Charlie and I have faced this situation from time to time at Berkshire subsidiaries. Humans age at greatly varying rates, but sooner or later their talents and vigor decline. Some managers remain effective well into their 80s and others noticeably fade in their 60s. When their abilities ebb, so usually do their powers of self-assessment. Someone else often needs to blow the whistle. When that time comes for me, our board will have to step up to the job. From a financial standpoint, its members are unusually motivated to do so. I know of no other board in the country in which the financial interests of directors are so completely aligned with those of shareholders. Few boards even come close. On a personal level, however, it is extraordinarily difficult for most people to tell someone, particularly a friend, that he or she is no longer capable. If I become a candidate for that message, however, our board will be doing me a favor by delivering it. Every share of Berkshire that I own is destined to go to philanthropies, and I want society to reap the maximum good from these gifts and bequests. It would be a tragedy if the philanthropic potential of my holdings was diminished because my associates shirked their responsibility to, tenderly, I hope, show me the door. But don't worry about this. We have an outstanding group of directors, and they will always do what's right for the shareholders. I have arranged for the bulk of my Berkshire holdings to go to 5 charitable foundations, thus carrying out part of my lifelong plan to eventually use all of my shares for philanthropic purposes. In my will, I've stipulated that the proceeds from all Berkshire shares I still own at death are to be used for philanthropic purposes within 10 years after my estate is closed. Because my affairs are not complicated, it should take 3 years at most for this closing to occur. Adding this 13-year period to my expected lifespan means that proceeds from all of my Berkshire shares will likely be distributed for societal purposes over the next 2 decades. I've set this schedule because I want the money to be spent relatively promptly by people I know to be capable, vigorous, and motivated. These managerial attributes sometimes wane as institutions, particularly those that are exempt from market forces, age. Today, there are terrific people in charge at the 5 foundations. So at my death, why should they not move with dispatch to judiciously spend the money that remains? Those people favoring perpetual foundations argue that in the future there will most certainly be large and important societal problems that philanthropy will need to address. I agree. But there will then also be many super-rich individuals and families whose wealth will exceed that of today's Americans and to whom philanthropic organizations can make their case for funding. These funders can then judge firsthand which operations would have both the vitality and the focus to best address the major societal problems that then exist. In this way, a market test of ideas and effectiveness can be applied. Some organizations will deserve major support while others will have outlived their usefulness. Even if the people above ground make their decisions imperfectly, they should be able to allocate funds more rationally than a descendant 6 feet under will have ordained decades earlier. Wills, of course, can always be rewritten, but it's very unlikely that my thinking will change in a material way. Lest we end on a morbid note, I also want to assure you that I have never felt better. I love running Berkshire, and if enjoying life promotes longevity, Methuselah's record is in jeopardy.